All right, we are back for the second part of Chapter 2 PowerPoint. We're talking about costs and categories of costs, so that you'll understand that as we start using them. Costs can fall in more than one category, right? You can have a production cost that is also a direct materials cost, right? So there's more than one category. One way we divide costs is by prime costs and conversion costs, right? So again, we're talking about product costs. So you could have direct materials plus labor is your prime cost, right? That makes sense. It's like the actual stuff that went into making this. The conversion cost is the direct labor and overhead. So what it takes to convert direct materials into the cost object, right? So prime costs, conversion costs, need to understand those distinctions. There we go. Non-production costs, two separate categories of those. Marketing, right, and administrative. Marketing, just like it sounds, what does it take to get that product or service in the hands of our customer? So marketing we tend to think of as advertising, but freight, storage, a lot of things go into marketing. And administrative costs, salaries, legal fees, research, things like that, just the admin of that product. All right, so marketing and administrative costs are not inventoried, they're called period costs. So what that means is period costs are matched to revenues, right? They're within a certain period, right? Not inventoried. That means they're not going to become part of the finished goods inventory. They're not going to become part of cost of goods sold. They're going to be separated out. So marketing costs and administrative costs, selling and admin, right? The selling and admin costs are going to be separate on the financial statements, right? So that's GAAP. You don't want to put that stuff in there and have it become cost of goods sold. So we're going to keep that separate. Period costs are expense in the period they incurred. So if you pay commission to a salesperson, right, you can match that up to a certain revenue and you expense it in that period. So that's why it's called a period cost. It's going on a certain period's income statement. Costs, on the other hand, that are becoming inventoried, your direct materials, your direct labor, and your overhead that are associated with production of that product or service, those are going to go into inventory, right? So you can imagine your direct materials, your direct labor plus overhead become work in process. Work in process becomes finished goods inventory, all right? So that's that asset. That's what we mean by it's being inventoried. But not everything becomes part of the inventory. Not everything is overhead, all right? So that's another thing to keep in mind. Some things are period costs. They're not really overhead. They're not really associated with a specific cost object. So period costs are expense in the period they're incurred. That's what we're getting at. And when we get a little further down and you read in the chapter, or you read in the chapter hopefully, about the financial statements, and you recall that multiple step income statement for sales organizations where they take out that cost of goods sold, that's what we mean by inventoried. It's going to work its way into the cost of goods manufactured, into inventory, into cost of goods sold. All right, so there's production costs, non-production, or what we might call operating costs. So production costs are direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. The prime costs are the direct materials and the direct labor. The direct labor and the overhead are conversion costs. You're going to also have some other expenses that are not part of overhead, and this tends to be a little confusing to students, so I want to reiterate it. Not everything is overhead. There are some marketing expenses and what some textbooks call selling expenses and administrative expenses that are broken out separately on the financial statement. All right, so keep that in mind. Not every single thing is getting allocated to a cost object. Prime costs are getting allocated and conversion costs are getting allocated, right? So we trace direct, we allocate overhead. And those become part of inventory. All right? These expenses, period costs, they come out as expenses on the income statement. All right, so that's what we're getting at, income statement, right? Because it's all about keeping track of information, reporting it out. One of the things we report out is the income statement. So they're for external parties. They are for the bankers who are going to lend you money. They're for the people who might purchase the stock. You have to report to the SEC on your 10K. Income statements. If you're a manufacturing firm, you have to follow a certain format, and it's called absorption costing or full cost costing. All manufacturing costs are fully assigned to the product. Expenses are separated according to function and then deducted from revenues to arrive at operating income. The two major functional categories of expense are cost of goods sold and operating expenses, right? That just sounds pretty familiar. I mean, this is financial accounting. We in this class are going to be really concerned with coming up with the cost of the goods manufactured and cost of goods sold. All right. So, cost of goods manufactured is the total cost. Only costs assigned to goods completed are manufacturing costs of materials, labor, and overhead. So these details get reported out. Then the cost of goods sold are the manufacturing costs of the units that were sold during the period. So you can imagine that as we make these pencils, right, we are keeping track of the cost of the goods manufactured. They become our inventory, right? The cost of goods manufactured, every time I manufacture a pencil, it costs me a nickel, right? So every time I add a pencil to inventory, I increase my cost of goods manufactured a nickel. When I actually sell this pencil, it's no longer an asset, and it's cost of goods sold, and whatever I sell during the period, that's my cost of goods sold. So the pencil doesn't become a cost of goods sold till I sell it. Okay. So how do we track these costs? Well, there's what we call traditional cost accounting, and it assumes all costs can be classified as fixed or variable, and the variable costs change according to the number of units. It's pretty simple. We only use unit-based drivers. It's a pretty easy way to do costs. All right, it assigns costs to organizational units. When we do controlling, we assign it to units. Hold the manager responsible for the costs and trace costs to individuals who are responsible for the costs. Then there's this ABC cost management system. So you've probably heard of this. This should have been something you learned a little bit about in 2302. Activity-based costing we'll refer to as ABC, emphasizes tracing over allocation. So activity-based costing really came into vogue when we got these big enterprise resource planning software systems, these ERPs, like SAP, like Oracle, and it made it really easier to trace every little thing that was happening. So they started using this activity-based costing where you really trace exactly where every cost is going and you base it on drivers, all right? Those are not units. It's not like every time I make a pencil, I have this much direct cost. It's like every 5 machine hours on the pencil making machine is the equivalent of this much cost, right? So we use drivers. And activity-based cost controls focus on accountabilities for activities rather than the costs, and we try to improve customer value. All right, so traditional, this category is straight from your book, unit-based, allocation-intensive, rigid, narrow, focus on costs. Activity-based does have unit and non-unit based drivers. It's very tracing intensive because now we've got these computer systems that let us do all this tracing. Flexible, it's used to maximize operational performance. And we'll do some of each of those. All right, so we're going to end chapter 2 here. You may want to watch the video where I work a couple problems like the homework stuff, or you may want to move on to the homework if you feel pretty comfortable. But I will have a few videos on some homework problems. All right, good luck with the rest of chapter 2.